working in the public service is fantastic, but hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy. My name is Crispin. We have a program here focused on life in government, how to be a successful public servant, have a good public sector career, how to influence government policy as an outsider, just a general interest in advocacy and change. Today, I want to list 5 things that are problems or drawbacks of working in government, right? I think working in the government is an amazing thing to do, and I strongly encourage everyone who has an interest in public service to pursue that kind of career. However, there are 5 significant drawbacks, and if these happen to be your personal bugbears, you may want to rethink your career in this area. So I don't want to list these in any particular order because it really comes down to personal issues. These are just my 5 drawbacks, okay? So coming in at number 5 is meetings. There are meetings at an unbelievable amount of your life will be consumed by meetings of varying degrees of relevance to you, right? So now this is important because government needs to be coordinated across different agencies, jurisdictions, profiles, portfolios, and so you'll have inter-agency meetings all of the time, and then within teams and across teams, because often these agencies are quite large, or they're working on programs of multiple different skill sets and disciplines, that you will be having a lot of meetings, right? So every week expect to have a team meeting, then like a section meeting, and then some kind of interdisciplinary or jurisdictional meeting, some kind of cross-agency meeting, and then if you're working on a particular project, there might be meetings with stakeholders, there might be meetings with government representatives, there might be meetings with parliamentary process people, like there's all these constant meetings, and if there's one word that you are going to become nauseous with in your public sector career is the word consultation, right? So just be aware that if you like meetings, great, you will have a lot of them, right? If you don't like meetings, when you think that it's going to interrupt with your actual doing the work, there's a lot of talking about work, but these meetings are important. So that's the one thing I would say is, look, it's not just talk fest. It's not about the perception of bureaucrats not actually doing any work. They have to do their work as well as do these meetings, right? So it actually creates a lot more of a burden. So having meetings is not about, going and having a 3-hour lunch. It's about agreeing on the work that needs to happen, and then in addition to that, somehow finding the time to do it. So number 5 would be meetings. Number 4, risk aversion. Now you have to understand that most public sector agencies have a priority about not appearing on the front page of any newspaper, not being seen to be wasteful or incompetent or failing in any particular way, which means that because the cost of failure is perceived as high, either for political reasons or public sector accountability reasons or media reasons, there is a strong desire among most public officials and most public agencies to avoid any kind of risk-taking, right? So in the private sector, you might spend $1 million on something that only has a modest chance of success because you think that it's worth spending that $1 million to test failure and to fail early, to get lessons learned, perhaps have an unexpected success. That's just part and parcel of successful private business. Whereas in the public sector, you do a lot more front-end work before you get to a point where you can start spending a lot of money. And that front-end work is designed to encourage people to perceive that the risk is either lower than previously anticipated or highly managed in a way that it is not significantly residual. Because the risk aversion in the public sector is because the cost of failure is much higher in the public sector because it's public money. If you're perceived as wasting public money, allocating resources in an incompetent or ineffective manner, then that will limit your own career, it will limit the reputation and budget resources of the agency you work for, you'll get political consequences as well. So all of these things create an atmosphere of risk aversion, even when it may not be optimal. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now that's fine. You actually become very good at managing risk, and you understand what the stakeholders are looking for. So you can tend to get more things through once you understand the process and why certain risk approaches are being done in a certain way. But nevertheless, if you are someone who likes to live on the edge, then your personal risk tolerance is probably not going to be the same as the risk tolerance of the agency you work for. So just keep that in mind. Coming in number 3, the pay trajectory is extremely flat. So it's kind of a mixed bag. When you join the public sector, your base salary is going to be much higher, usually, on average, to other people who are just graduating from their university degree. That the base level salaries for most government officials are quite attractive, right? So if you come in at a sort of a level 3, level 4 in the public sector, then your pay is likely to be much higher than someone who's just starting a graduate program in some kind of private equity law firm or consulting firm or something like that. Particularly given the work and competitive nature of the private-public sector divide, you're much more likely to be eased into your career with a degree of probably pedagogy and learning, without the sort of sink or swim mentality that comes from a lot of private sector agencies. So when you're starting your career, the public sector is very attractive. But as you move into the higher levels, you get a lot more responsibility because the buck really does stop with the senior executive in most public sector agencies. But the pay scale is much more flat, particularly when you compare it to the private sector, where executive pay is perhaps a little bit too astronomical relative to the average worker. You don't see anything like that in the public sector. The difference between a senior executive in the public sector and a base level employee is nowhere near as stark as you'll see in the private sector, which from an ethical kind of general fairness point of view might be perceived as a positive. However, the level of responsibility that senior public officials have is vastly greater than that of junior officials. The scope and breadth of what they're dealing with is at least equal to senior executives of private firms, and yet their remunerations are nowhere near on the same scale. So if you are someone that wants to be financially rewarded for effort, and look, there shouldn't be a pejorative attitude to that. If you have the opportunity to apply your skills in a private sector environment that's going to pay you 5, 10, 20, 100 times more than what you get in the public sector, well, that is going to be something you have to take into consideration, right? So do keep in mind that your pay trajectory in the public sector is not as attractive as it is in the private sector, even though you definitely do have a lot of benefits when you start out in your early career. There are obviously some other pay benefits as well with the public sector, because it tends to have much more flexible working conditions. So you have maternity leave, you have your long service, you have your often flex time, things like that. So you can kind of work around family obligations in a way that may not be possible in the private sector. But nevertheless, that pay scale is much flatter, and that has to be counted as a drawback. Another issue is, coming in at number 2, is hierarchy. Now, this is an issue that has burned me a number of times in my career, where there is a very strict hierarchy in the public sector. That's it's military-esque. In fact, if you work in the Australian Defence Department, you're given a military equivalent rank in order to manage that hierarchical relationship, so that you can interact with service personnel and so forth with your civilian colleagues in order to work out how to handle such an orderly structure. Now, that is similar across most public sector agencies, where you have your secretary or your director or your CEO, depending on the type of agency, all the way down to your base level employee. But the order is usually rigid. It's all is supposed to be clear, but isn't always. And often it's segmented not just in terms of your boss, their boss, their boss, their boss, but also across areas of discipline as well. So on the one hand, you have your generic hierarchy, but then you'll also have your specialized hierarchies, such as you might find in, say, an engineering firm where you might have your senior personnel, but there might be a subject matter expert that in a certain area is of a higher kind of rank in that particular field relative to the person who generically over the organisation might have more influence. If that sounds Byzantine to you, that is actually really challenging to navigate, and people get incredibly precious about people stepping on what is perceived to be their turf, right? So that can be career limiting. If you upset the wrong people, even if you have the best of intentions, that can really hurt you in your career trajectory. And it's a mistake that I make all the time. Like I tend to have this sort of laser-like focus on what's in the best interest of the public, what's in the best interest of the minister, what's in the best interest of the organisation. And the internal politics, hierarchy, structures and all of that is like a really distant thing down my list of considerations. Often I act before I even get to that point. Now, that is not a healthy way to do things, because people do have a lot of expertise and knowledge and areas of responsibility and an interest in being able to make sure things are done in an appropriate, good governance and orderly way. So if you like hierarchy, if it's something that suits you, by all means join the public sector, but realise that it is more rigid than you will find in the private sector environment. Even in the private sector, people will tend to give you a lot more rope if you seem to be acting with initiative and the best interests of the agency and the best interests of the business and showing drive and initiative. Those sorts of things have much more rigid boundaries in the public sector, appropriately so, because it's not you ultimately who's on the chopping block as it is in the private sector where you just get let go. In the public sector, what you do reflects on the agency and the government in a wholly different way, and so people do get much more sensitive about the way in which you behave if it's outside of the normal process. So keep that in mind. And then coming in at number one, and I actually do think this is number one. I did say there wasn't a hierarchy, but what I observe in the public sector as being the biggest drawback is that people often get disillusioned, right? You get these young people with tremendous drive and initiative and intellect who are passionate about their public sector issues and want to make positive, consistent change. And because things don't happen anywhere near the pace that they anticipate it will be, they often feel a great sense of disillusionment and, in many tragic cases, drop out of the public sector entirely in pursuit of other opportunities. And I completely understand why this happens, right? In large part, though, it's a product of expectation. People have this sort of vision of what their public sector career is going to look like, where they identify all these problems that they see in the world and they feel that they can make a really significant positive change by coming in with a drive and energy and getting other like-minded people involved and drawing, in a particularly positive policy direction. And that's absolutely the attitude you should bring to the public service and maintain as long as possible while in the public service, but tempered by the realities of politics, of economics, of competing priorities, of all kinds of myriad of issues that create a sense of disillusionment. I think that the number one cause of this is that oftentimes people are invested in projects and initiatives and things like that, and they spend a lot of their time trying to implement something quite significant, only for the rug to be pulled out from underneath them because the whole agency, government, country goes in a completely separate direction. That can be, from a change of political party, that can be a change in policy direction, even a switch out of minister and so on that often happens in government, a machinery of government change where a particular agency is melded with another agency. the drying up of various funds, some sort of external economic crisis, a whole bunch of things, or just generally a change in attitude from key stakeholders. You can be a long way down a particular path and then just have it stopped through no fault of your own, and that can be incredibly stifling for many public sector officials. Now, people like myself who understand all of this going into any particular project or program, I don't have that same degree of disappointment because I'm very clear about what's within my control and what is not in my control, and I strongly encourage that attitude among everybody in the public sector to kind of be like, yes, do everything in your power to get a positive outcome, but realise that you are an instrument of government policy, not the creator of government policy, and therefore as a functionary, you have to understand the limits of your influence and be aware of that at the time that you commence a particular activity. But nevertheless, despite this kind of message I'm trying to get across, it can be very dispiriting for a large number of otherwise extremely energetic and enthusiastic and committed public officials to consistently find that their significant landmark initiatives are no longer the kind of legacy things that they would wish them to be. So keep that in mind. There's 5 really key things. If you have any of your own, if you're in the public sector or you've heard things about the public sector, have questions about other issues and concerns that you've heard out there in the ether, please put them in the comment section. We'll address them. And if you find value in this top 5 list, there are other videos as well in government you can look at. Please like and subscribe. You can watch those other videos right now. And thank you very much. I'll see you next time.